A single wrong digit on a cracked phone screen. That's all it takes to derail a life. Charisse didn't mean to contact the man who controlled the city's underground port. She just wanted to tell her ex she made a mistake. But the text went to Ramona Cassell, a man who hadn't heard someone say they missed him in a decade. His reply didn't ask who she was. It gave an address. And Charisse, desperate and exhausted, actually showed up. The radiator in Charisse's apartment didn't produce heat, only sound. It clanked like a wrench thrown into a washing machine, a steady, rhythmic metal-on-metal thud that made the freezing air feel even more oppressive. She sat on her faded thrift store sofa, a blanket pulled up to her chin, watching her breath plume in the dim light of a street lamp filtering through the blinds. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. Her phone sat on the coffee table. The screen was severely shattered in the top left corner, the cracks spiderwebbing down over the keypad. She stared at it. She had worked a 14-hour shift at the diner, smelling of old grease and stale coffee, dealing with truckers and insomniacs. Her feet throbbed. Her bank account was overdrawn by $12. And she was lonely. The kind of bone-deep, hollow lonely that makes smart people do profoundly stupid things. She missed Greg. She shouldn't have. Greg was a bartender who drank more than he poured, a man who borrowed money for investments that usually involved a poker table in a basement. He had left her 3 weeks ago, taking her microwave and her last shred of dignity. But sitting in the freezing dark, the brain plays tricks. It edits out the yelling, the unpaid bills, the slammed doors. It only replays the warm weight of another human being in an empty bed. She reached for the phone. Her fingers were stiff with cold. She hadn't saved his new number. He had changed it after a dispute with a bookie. But she had memorized it off a napkin he'd left on the counter. She opened a new message, typed the area code. Then the rest, 4429184. Her thumb slipped on the cracked glass, grazing the 5 instead of the 4 at the very end. She didn't notice. "I miss you," she typed. "I know I shouldn't, but I do. Please let me come over." She hit send. The moment the little bubble turned green, a wave of instant, nauseating regret washed over her. She tossed the phone back onto the table and buried her face in her hands. She was pathetic. He wasn't going to answer. Or worse, he would answer. And she would spend the next 3 hours in his dingy apartment, smelling like stale beer, only to be asked to leave before the sun came up. 10 minutes passed. The radiator clanked. The phone vibrated against the particle board table. Charisse jumped. She picked it up, her heart doing a strange, uneven flutter. The reply was from the unsaved number. It didn't sound like Greg. Greg texted in erratic fragments, full of typos and half-thoughts. This message was crisp, punctuated, cold. 1420 North Harbor Drive. Pier 4, come to the service door. 3:00 a.m., do not be late. She frowned. 1420 North Harbor Drive. Greg lived in a basement out in the suburbs, miles from the water. Why was he at the harbor? He had mentioned a new gig unloading freight, something about cash under the table. Maybe he was on a night shift. Do not be late. That sounded like Greg trying to be authoritative, playing a game. Charisse looked at the clock. 2:28 a.m. The harbor was 20 minutes away if she didn't hit any red lights. She shouldn't go. Every survival instinct she possessed told her to turn off the phone, crawl under the thin mattress, and sleep it off. But the silence in the apartment was suffocating. The cold was unbearable. She just wanted to be somewhere else, anywhere else. She threw off the blanket, shoved her feet into a pair of worn leather boots, and grabbed her heavy wool coat. The drive was a blur of empty streets and blinking yellow traffic lights. The city at this hour felt entirely abandoned, a concrete shell stripped of its daytime inhabitants. As she neared the waterfront, the smell of salt and rotting seaweed leaked through the vents of her beat-up sedan. North Harbour Drive was a desolate stretch of industrial warehouses, chain-link fences, and towering cranes that looked like skeletal metal beasts against the night sky. Pier 4 was at the far end, surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. She pulled up to the gate. It was open. She drove through slowly, her headlights cutting across the cracked asphalt. She parked near a massive corrugated metal building. The service door was just a heavy steel slab set into the wall, illuminated by a single, flickering yellow bulb. Charisse cut the engine. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant lapping of water against the concrete pylons. She stepped out of the car. The wind coming off the bay was brutal, biting through her coat instantly. She walked up to the door, raised a fist, knocked. Nothing happened. She waited a full minute, shivering, hugging herself. "Greg," she called out, feeling stupid. The heavy steel door didn't open. Instead, a voice came from behind her. "Keep your hands exactly where they are." Charisse froze. The voice was deep, gravelly, and entirely lacking in warmth. It was not Greg. She turned her head slowly. A man stepped out from the shadows of a nearby shipping container. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark peacoat. In his right hand, resting casually against his thigh, was a suppressed handgun. "Turn around," he said. Charisse's throat closed up. She turned. "Phone," the man demanded. She fumbled in her pocket with trembling fingers, pulling out her cracked phone and holding it out. The man snatched it. He tapped the screen, glancing at it, then looked at her. His eyes were dead, analytical. "Who sent you?" he asked. "Sent me?" Charisse's voice cracked. "Nobody. I'm here to see Greg." "There's no Greg here." The man stepped closer, patting her down quickly and efficiently, checking her coat pockets and her waistline. "You sent the message to the boss." "The boss?" Panic was a cold wire tightening around her lungs. "I don't know what you're talking about. I sent a text to my ex-boyfriend. I think I got the wrong number." The man stared at her for a long moment. He pressed a small earpiece deeper into his ear. "Got a girl here," he murmured into a microphone hidden in his collar. "Unarmed. Claims she's a wrong number looking for a boyfriend." "Yeah. Okay." He lowered his hand and gestured toward the steel door. It clicked and swung inward on well-oiled hinges. "Inside," he said. "I'd rather just go home," Charisse whispered, her eyes darting toward her car. The man raised the gun an inch. It wasn't a threat so much as a factual statement of how things were going to proceed. Inside, the interior of the warehouse didn't look like a loading dock. It was hollowed out, but the center of the massive space had been converted into a makeshift, high-end office suite. Glass walls stood in stark contrast to the rusted steel beams overhead. The floor was polished concrete. Leather furniture sat on expensive rugs. The smell of the ocean was replaced by the scent of fresh espresso and old paper. Charisse was escorted up a short flight of metal stairs and pushed gently into the glass-walled room. A man sat behind a massive oak desk. He didn't look like a mob boss. He didn't have slicked-back hair or wear a garish suit. Ramona Cassell looked like a tired architect. He wore a simple, dark grey cashmere sweater over a white collar. His dark hair was slightly messy, cut close on the sides. He was in his mid-30s, his face sharply angled, a shadow of stubble along his jaw. He was reading a stack of manifests, a pen twirling absently between his fingers. He didn't look up when she entered. "Sit," he said. His voice was quiet, smooth, carrying an undercurrent of absolute authority. Charisse remained standing. Her legs felt like they were made of water. "I just want to leave. This is a misunderstanding." Ramona stopped twirling the pen. He looked up. His eyes were a flat, opaque brown. They gave nothing away. He looked at her cracked phone, which his guard had placed on the corner of the desk. "I have possessed this phone number for exactly 6 hours," Ramona said, his tone conversational. "It is a burner line. Only 3 people in the state have it. None of them are a waitress with a cheap coat and a tremor in her hands." He leaned back in his chair. "So when I receive a text on a highly secure line from an unknown number saying, 'I miss you, let me come over,' I do not assume it is a romantic gesture. I assume it is a code, an indicator that a rival crew has located me, or that law enforcement is attempting a rather clumsy sting. I gave you this address to see who would show up to kill me." Charisse stared at him, her brain struggling to process the words. "Kill you? I don't even know who you are." "I am aware of that now," Ramona said. He gestured to a monitor on his desk. "We ran your license plates when you pulled in. Charisse Kistler, 26. 1 traffic ticket from 3 years ago. You work at a diner on 4th Street. You have $42 in your checking account." Charisse flushed, anger momentarily piercing through her terror. "You hacked my bank account? I had my people make a phone call, yes. It took 30 seconds. Ramona sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked genuinely exhausted. "You are exactly what you appear to be. A girl who texted the wrong number at 2 in the morning. So let me go." "I can't." The 2 words dropped into the room like lead weights. Charisse took a step back toward the door. The guard was standing outside the glass, arms crossed. "What do you mean you can't? You just said I'm nobody." "You are nobody," Ramona agreed calmly. "But you are a nobody who now knows the exact location of my secondary operations hub. You saw the gate. You saw the guards. You saw my face. I won't tell anyone." People always say that, and then they drink, or they get scared, or they talk to a cop trying to get out of a speeding ticket. Ramona picked up the pen again. "You texted a ghost, Charisse, and ghosts don't like witnesses." Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She refused to let them fall. "Are you going to kill me?" Ramona looked at her, his expression softening just a fraction. It was the first sign of anything resembling humanity. "No, I don't kill civilians, but you aren't going back to your apartment tonight. You're going to stay here until we finish the shipment tomorrow night and move our base of operations. Then you can go. I have a shift at the diner tomorrow at noon. If I don't show up, I get fired." Ramona let out a short, dry laugh. It held no humor. "You are sitting in a room with men who move unregistered weapons through a metropolitan port, and you are worried about a diner shift." "It's the only job I have," Charisse snapped, her fear suddenly boiling over into frustration. "I need that job to pay for the apartment I can barely afford to heat. Not all of us have glass offices inside shipping warehouses." Silence stretched across the room. Ramona stared at her, assessing. He didn't look angry at her outburst. He looked curious. Before he could speak, the glass wall behind him shattered. It wasn't a crack. It was an explosion. A hail of automatic gunfire tore through the warehouse. The heavy oak desk splintered as bullets chewed into the wood. Ramona moved with terrifying speed. In a fraction of a second, he had vaulted over the desk, tackled Charisse to the polished concrete floor, and covered her body with his own. The noise was deafening. Alarms began to blare. The shouting of men echoed through the cavernous space. "Stay down!" Ramona roared over the din, drawing a weapon from a holster at his hip. Charisse curled into a ball, pressing her hands over her ears, screaming. The world had gone mad. Concrete dust rained down on them. The smell of cordite and burning electrical wire filled the air. Ramona fired back blindly over the ruined desk. He grabbed Charisse by the collar of her coat. "Move! Now!" He dragged her toward a heavy steel door at the back of the office. She scrambled on her hands and knees, cutting her palms on the shattered glass. Bullets ricocheted off the metal doorframe as Ramona shoved her inside and slammed the door shut, throwing a heavy deadbolt. They were in a small, windowless room lined with server racks. The sound of the gunfire was muffled here, reduced to a heavy, rhythmic thumping against the reinforced steel. Ramona leaned against the door, breathing heavily. He checked his weapon, popping the magazine out and slamming it back in. He looked down at Charisse, who was curled on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, blood dripping from a cut on her hand. "Well," Ramona said grimly, the cynical edge returning to his voice. "It seems my location was compromised after all. Good thing you showed up to test the security." The shooting stopped after exactly 4 minutes. To Charisse, shivering on the floor of the server room, it felt like 4 hours. Every muffled crack of gunfire made her flinch. She had never heard a gun fired in real life. It didn't sound like the movies. It was louder, flatter, more violent. It sounded like the air itself was being ripped apart. Ramona didn't flinch. He stood near the door, entirely still, his head tilted as he listened to the rhythm of the violence outside. He was tracking the shots, recognizing the distinct pops of different calibers. When the silence finally settled, thick and heavy, Ramona keyed his radio. "Status," Static hissed. Then a voice, out of breath. "Clear, boss. It was the Petrov crew. 3 vehicles breached the north gate. We repelled them, 2 of ours down, 4 of theirs." Ramona's jaw tightened. "Secure the perimeter. Start the scrub. We move everything in 1 hour." He turned off the radio and looked down at Charisse. She was clutching her bleeding hand to her chest, her eyes wide, staring at him as if he were a monster. To her, he supposed, he was. "Get up," he said, offering his free hand. She shrank back. "Don't touch me." Ramona dropped his hand. He didn't have time for bedside manners. "They missed the main target, which means they'll fall back and watch the roads. It's not safe to leave through the front. We are leaving through the water tunnels. You are coming with me." "No," Charisse said, finding her voice. "I'm leaving. I'm getting in my car and I'm driving home." "Your car is full of holes, Charisse," Ramona stated flatly. "It was parked directly in their line of fire. It's a miracle it hasn't caught fire. Furthermore, the police will be here in less than 10 minutes. If you are here when they arrive, you will be arrested in a warehouse filled with illegal arms. You will go to federal prison. Do you understand?" Charisse blinked. The reality of the situation crashed down on her, heavier than the freezing temperature of her apartment. She was trapped. She had texted a stranger, and now she was an accessory to a mob war. She stood up slowly, her knees wobbling. "Where are we going?" "A safe house. You will stay there until this is resolved." "And then?" "And then I'll figure out what to do with you," Ramona said. He opened the heavy steel door. The office was destroyed. Glass littered the floor like ice. The smell of gunpowder was choking. Ramona guided her by the elbow, steering her away from the shattered windows and toward a trapdoor set into the floor near the rear loading bay. They climbed down a rusting iron ladder into the damp, echoing darkness of the city's old storm drain system. The water was ankle-deep and freezing. Charisse gasped as it soaked through her boots, but she kept moving. She didn't have a choice. Ramona walked ahead of her, a flashlight in one hand, his gun in the other. "Why didn't you just let them shoot me?" Charisse asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Her teeth were chattering. "I'm a liability. You said it yourself. Ghosts don't like witnesses." Ramona kept his eyes on the tunnel ahead. "Because I don't kill civilians, and because, against all logic, you saved my life." Charisse stopped walking. What? Ramona paused, turning the flashlight slightly so it illuminated the concrete wall, not blinding her. If you hadn't sent that text, I would have been asleep in my apartment across town. The Petrovs knew my schedule. They hit my apartment at the exact same time they hit the warehouse. My men just confirmed it. If I was home, I would be dead. But I came here to wait for the person who texted my secure line. He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable in the dim light. Your wrong number pulled me out of a kill zone, Charisse. You inadvertently did me a massive favor. Charisse stared at him, shivering. So, we're even? Ramona gave a short, cynical laugh. In my world, a life debt is not settled with a "we're even." I owe you, and I don't like owing people. It makes things messy. I don't want anything from you, she said, her voice shaking. I just want my life back. Your life is gone, Ramona said bluntly, turning back to the tunnel. The Petrovs have your plates. They know you were at the warehouse. They will assume you belong to me. If you go back to that freezing apartment, they will find you, and they will use you to get to me. I don't belong to you. To them, you do. Ramona resumed walking. Until I dismantle the Petrovs, you are under my protection. Welcome to the family, Charisse. She stood in the freezing water, listening to the echoing splash of his footsteps. She had wanted someone to talk to. She had wanted someone to care that she existed. She had typed one wrong number, and now a crime boss claimed she belonged to him. Charisse pulled her thin coat tighter around her chest and followed him into the dark. A man in a heavy coat stood by the rear passenger door. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even look at Charisse. He merely opened the door and stepped back. Ramona nudged her forward. Charisse climbed in, sinking into the leather seats. The interior smelled of expensive pine and leather cleaner. It was a jarring contrast to the freezing, rat-infested water she had just waded through. She pulled her sweat knees to her chest, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together. Ramona slid in beside her, the door shut, sealing them in a soundproof bubble. Drive, Ramona said. The SUV glided out of the garage and into the desolate city streets. The heater kicked on, blasting warm air over Charisse's soaked legs. She closed her eyes, the adrenaline that had kept her moving finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a hollow, nauseating exhaustion. 20 minutes later, they pulled into an underground parking structure beneath a towering glass and steel high-rise in the financial district. The building was aggressively modern, the kind of place where corporate executives kept anonymous second homes. They took a private elevator that required Ramona to press his thumb against a biometric scanner. The car shot upward with stomach-dropping speed, depositing them directly into the penthouse. The safe house was beautiful and entirely devoid of life. It was a sprawling expanse of white marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sleeping city, and minimalist furniture that looked too expensive to sit on. There were no photographs, no books, no signs that a human being had ever spent more than a few hours here. It wasn't a home, it was a holding cell with a better view. Take off the coat and the boots, Ramona instructed, shrugging off his own damp peacoat and tossing it over a pristine white leather chair. Leave them by the door. Charisse complied clumsily. Her hands were still numb. She kicked off the ruined leather boots and let her cheap wool coat drop to the floor. Underneath, she wore a faded band t-shirt and jeans that were soaked up to the mid-calf. Ramona walked into a sleek kitchen and opened a cabinet, retrieving a white plastic box. He carried it to the living area and set it on the glass coffee table. Sit, he commanded, pointing to the sofa. Charisse sat on the absolute edge of the cushion. Ramona sat adjacent to her, popping the latches on the first aid kit. He pulled out a bottle of antiseptic, gauze, and medical tape. "Give me your hand," he said. She hesitated. pulling her injured hand closer to her chest. The cut on her palm, sustained when she fell onto the shattered glass in the warehouse, had stopped oozing, but it throbbed with a dull, insistent ache. "I can do it myself," she muttered. "Your hands are shaking too much. Give it to me." It wasn't a request. Charisse extended her arm. Ramona's grip was firm, his fingers warm and rough against her freezing skin. He examined the jagged slice across her palm with the clinical detachment of a mechanic inspecting a frayed wire. He poured the clear liquid over the wound. It stung with a vicious, sudden fire. Charisse hissed, trying to pull away, but Ramona held her wrist tightly. "Hold still. There's concrete dust in it," he said, taking a cotton pad and wiping away the debris. "You're enjoying this," she accused, glaring at him. "I assure you, acting as a nurse to a waitress who doesn't know how to verify a phone number was not on my agenda for tonight," Ramona replied smoothly. He began wrapping the gauze around her palm, moving with practiced efficiency. "You should be grateful. I'm usually the one putting holes in people, not patching them up." "Is that supposed to make me feel safe? It's supposed to establish reality." He taped the gauze secure and released her hand. "You live in a world where things are fair, where bad things happen to bad people, and if you work hard, you pay your rent. I live in the real world. In the real world, the Petrovs don't care that you just serve coffee. They only care that you were standing next to me when the bullets started flying. To them, you are a pressure point." Charisse stared at the white bandage on her hand. The sheer absurdity of the night threatened to crush her. She had been freezing in a terrible apartment 3 hours ago, mourning a terrible man. Now she was a geopolitical pawn in a war she didn't understand. "I need to call my boss," she whispered, the panic rising again. "I have the lunch shift. If I don't show up, Brenda will fire me. And if she fires me, I can't pay my landlord. He's already threatening to evict me." Ramona leaned back against the sofa, studying her. The exhaustion on his face was profound, settling into the sharp lines around his mouth. "Let me understand this," Ramona said slowly. "Someone just fired 400 rounds of ammunition at us. You are currently hiding in a secure location owned by a criminal syndicate, and your primary concern is an eviction notice?" "Yes," Charisse snapped, her voice cracking. "Because when you tell me I can leave, I have to go back to my life. I don't have a safety net. I don't have savings. I have that job and that terrible apartment. If I lose them, I am on the street. You might not understand that from up here in your glass tower, but a missed shift ruins my life just as thoroughly as a bullet." Ramona stared at her for a long, quiet minute. The cynicism in her voice wasn't an act. It was the desperate, clawing reality of someone who had spent their entire life standing on a ledge. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick silver money clip, and tossed it onto the glass table. It hit with a heavy thud. It was thick with $100 bills. "That is $10,000, Ramona said. "Consider it advance payment for your time. Your rent is covered. Your diner job is irrelevant. You work for me now." Charisse stared at the stack of currency. It was more money than she had ever seen in one place. It looked dirty. It looked like a trap. "I'm not a prostitute," she said, her voice shaking with quiet fury. Ramona closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, tired breath. "Neither am I, Charisse. The money is to buy your peace of mind, so you stop whining about your waitress job while I try to keep us alive. You are my alibi, my liability, and my guest. Go down the hall. Second door on the left is a guest room. There is a shower. There are clean clothes in the closet. Sleep." He stood up, grabbing his radio from his belt. The conversation was over. Charisse looked at the money, then at Ramona's back as he walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city he supposedly owned. She didn't touch the cash. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself, and walked down the cold marble hallway. Charisse woke to the smell of black coffee and the muffled sound of low voices. For a terrifying, disorienting second, she didn't know where she was. The mattress was too soft, the sheets too heavy, the room too dark. Then the memory of the shattered glass and the deafening gunfire crashed into her skull. She sat up abruptly, clutching the silk duvet to her chest. Her hand throbbed. The white bandage was a stark reminder that it wasn't a nightmare. She swung her legs out of bed. The clothes Ramona had promised were in the closet, a pair of high-end sweatpants and a soft grey cashmere sweater that hung loosely on her frame. They smelled like expensive laundry detergent. She dressed quickly, feeling like a child playing dress-up in a stranger's house. She pushed the bedroom door open and walked softly down the hallway. The living area was flooded with harsh morning sunlight. Ramona was sitting at a massive marble dining table, looking exactly as he had the night before, minus the jacket. A laptop was open in front of him, next to a steaming mug of coffee and a disassembled handgun. Standing across from him was a man Charisse hadn't seen before. He was older, perhaps in his 50s, with a neatly trimmed grey beard, wire-rimmed glasses, and a bespoke navy suit. He looked like a university professor, until you noticed the way his eyes tracked every shadow in the room. "The ports are locked down," the older man was saying, his voice a low, precise rumble. "The police found the warehouse. It's a circus. The Petrovs left 2 bodies behind, but neither had any identification. They're ghosts." "They aren't ghosts, Bennett. They're sloppy," Ramona replied, not looking up from his screen. "If they were professionals, they wouldn't have missed the primary target when they breached the perimeter. They rushed it. They rushed it because they thought they had the element of surprise," Bennett pointed out. He shifted his gaze, noticing Charisse lingering at the edge of the hallway. His expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened slightly. "And this is the variable." Ramona finally looked up, closing the laptop halfway. He studied Charisse for a moment, taking in the oversized sweater and the pale, exhausted cast of her face. "Charisse, this is Bennett. He handles my logistics," Ramona introduced smoothly. Bennett gave a curt, polite nod. "Miss Kistler." Charisse crossed her arms, suddenly hyper-aware of her unbrushed hair and the borrowed clothes. "You know my name." "I know everything about you, Miss Kistler. It is my job to know," Bennett said calmly. "Including the fact that your former boyfriend, Gregory, currently owes $12,000 to a low-level bookie operating out of the South Side." Charisse's stomach dropped. "Greg owes money?" "A substantial amount," Ramona interjected, leaning back in his chair. "Which brings us to an interesting theory Bennett posited this morning. The Petrovs knew my exact schedule. They knew the layout of the warehouse. They had inside information. And then, miraculously, an hour before the hit, a civilian with connections to an indebted degenerate texts my secure line, pulling me out of position." Charisse felt the air leave the room. The implication hung between them, heavy and suffocating. "You think I set you up?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "You think I texted you on purpose to what? Lure you out?" "It is a statistical anomaly," Bennett stated, tapping a folder on the table. "An incredibly convenient mistake. I told you the truth." Charisse stepped fully into the room, her fear entirely replaced by a sudden hot wave of indignation. She marched toward the table, glaring at Ramona. "I slipped on a cracked screen. You saw my phone. You saw the glass. If I was a criminal mastermind working for the Petrovs, do you think I'd be crying over a missed shift at a diner? Do you think I'd be living in an apartment that doesn't even have heat? Desperation makes people do highly profitable, highly dangerous things," Bennett said reasonably. Charisse ignored him, keeping her eyes locked on Ramona. "You said I saved your life. You said you owed me." Ramona held her gaze. His eyes were dark, calculating, searching her face for any crack in the veneer. After a long, stretching silence, he reached out and snapped the laptop completely shut. "Bennett is paid to be paranoid," Ramona said quietly. "If I thought you were working for the Petrovs, you wouldn't have woken up this morning in a guest room." Bennett sighed, a barely audible sound of disapproval. "Ramona." "She's clear, Bennett. Drop it." Ramona's voice brooked no argument. It was the tone of a man who commanded absolute obedience. He gestured to a silver carafe on the kitchen counter. "There's coffee, Charisse. Drink it. We have a long day." Charisse didn't move toward the coffee. She stayed planted in front of the table. "You said I work for you now. What does that mean?" Ramona picked up a cloth and began carefully wiping down the slide of the disassembled handgun. "It means you are going to stay out of sight, and you are going to do exactly what you are told until I eliminate the threat against us." "And what if I don't want to just sit in a cage and wait for you to fix it?" she challenged. Ramona paused, the cloth halfway down the metal barrel. He looked up, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his features. Most people in her position would be cowering in a corner, begging for a ticket out of the city. Charisse was standing her ground, her chin raised, her bandaged hand resting on her hip. "You want to contribute to a mob war, Charisse?" he asked, a cynical smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "What are you going to do? Refill the Petrovs' coffee until they surrender?" "I know the South Side," Charisse shot back, ignoring the insult. "If Greg owes money to a bookie down there, I know exactly who it is. He only plays at one place, a basement beneath a laundromat on 8th. If the Petrovs got their information through him, that's where you start." Bennett raised an eyebrow, exchanging a brief, silent look with Ramona. Ramona set the gun part down on the marble table. The smirk vanished, replaced by a sharp, assessing intensity. He was looking at her differently now, not as a helpless civilian, and not as a liability. "A laundromat on 8th, Ramona repeated softly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Well then, go drink your coffee, Charisse. It seems you just earned your keep." The South Side didn't look like a war zone. It looked like an apology. Row houses sagged under the weight of wet snow, their gutters choking on frozen leaves and garbage. The streets were an obstacle course of craters that threatened to swallow the tires of the black SUV. They idled half a block from a neon sign that buzzed a frantic, dying pink. Suds and duds. Charisse stared through the tinted window. Beside her, Ramona casually adjusted the cuffs of his dark coat. He didn't look nervous. He looked like a man preparing to inspect a remarkably dirty bathroom he was being forced to use. "You stay in the vehicle," Ramona said. He didn't look at her. His eyes were scanning the street, calculating angles, exits, and threats. "No," Charisse replied. Ramona turned his head slowly. The muscle in his jaw flexed, a microscopic twitch of irritation. "I am not taking a civilian into a basement run by an illegal bookmaker, Charisse. This isn't a field trip. And you are a guy wearing a $3,000 coat who smells like bergamot," she shot back, her voice tight but unwavering. "Mick runs the back room. He hates suits. He hates cops. And right now, you look like a very expensive combination of both. You walk down there with your hand inside your coat, someone is going to panic. They'll pull a gun, you'll shoot them, and we learn absolutely nothing." Ramona stared at her. The silence in the SUV grew thick, heavy with the hum of the engine and the faint sound of sirens blocks away. "Mick knows me," Charisse continued, swallowing the lump of fear in her throat. "He knows I used to come drag Greg out of there on Sunday nights when he blew our grocery money on football games. He'll talk to me." Ramona tapped a rhythm on his knee. He keyed the radio, hidden in his collar. "Hold position," he murmured to the men waiting in a trailing sedan. He looked back at Charisse, his opaque brown eyes stripping her down to her nerve endings. You walk in front of me. You do not raise your voice. If I tap your shoulder, you drop to the floor immediately. Do you understand? Yes. The air inside the laundromat was a physical weight, thick with humidity and the suffocating scent of cheap floral detergent. A few exhausted people sat on plastic chairs, staring blankly at the spinning drums of industrial washers. Charisse walked past them, keeping her chin up, aiming straight for a heavy, unmarked fire door at the back of the building. Ramona followed, a silent, imposing shadow that seemed to swallow the fluorescent light. She knocked on the metal door. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 2 more. Greg's old code. The heavy deadbolt clicked. The door opened a fraction, revealing a face that looked like a crushed catcher's mitt. We're closed to the public, the man grunted, chewing on a toothpick. Tell Mick it's Charisse, she said, wrapping her arms around her chest. Greg's ex. The man paused, looking past her shoulder to Ramona. His eyes narrowed instantly, his posture stiffening. He's with me, Charisse said, striving for a tone of utter exhaustion. He's the guy holding Greg's paper from the east side. We need to talk about his debts, now. The bouncer hesitated, then pulled the door open. The basement was a sensory assault. The air was blue with stale cigar smoke, smelling heavily of spilled beer, sweat, and the low, frantic murmur of desperate men betting money they didn't have. Flickering overhead lights illuminated green felt tables. In the far corner, behind a wire mesh cage that looked like a bank teller's window from hell, sat Mick. He was a grossly overweight man with a shining bald head and a surprisingly neat mustache, counting stacks of wrinkled bills. He looked up as Charisse approached the cage. Well, if it ain't the ball and chain, Mick wheezed, leaning back in a squeaking leather office chair. Greg ain't been here in a week, sweetheart. You're out of luck, and you look terrible. I'm not looking for him, Mick, Charisse said, resting her hands on the narrow wooden counter in front of the wire mesh. Her bandaged palm throbbed in time with her pulse. I'm looking for information. Mick's gaze drifted to Ramona. Ramona stood exactly 3 feet behind Charisse, perfectly still, his hands resting easily in the pockets of his coat. Mick wasn't stupid. He ran a basement casino in the worst part of the city. He recognized lethal danger when it walked into his room, wearing tailored clothes. Who's the stiff? Mick asked, his voice losing its jovial, mocking edge. I'm the man who wants to know how a degenerate gambler paid off a $12,000 deficit 3 days ago, Ramona said. His voice barely carried over the noise of the room, but its pitch was designed to cut through the air like a straight razor. Mick swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing the curve of his bald head. Privacy policy, pal. I don't discuss my client's finances with strangers. Ramona took a single step forward. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply removed his right hand from his pocket and placed it flat on the wooden counter. The movement was so deliberate, so laden with the promise of violence, that the betting table nearest to them went entirely dead silent. Cards stopped flipping. Dice stopped rolling. My name is Ramona Cassell, he said quietly. A group of Russians shot up my warehouse last night. Someone told them where to find me. Your ledger says Greg suddenly came into cash the day before. Now, you can either tell me who he sold the information to, or I can have my men weld that fire door shut and burn this building to the foundation with you locked inside this cage. Mick's face drained of color, leaving him looking like a bloated corpse. The street-tough bluster vanished instantly. He looked at Charisse, his eyes wide and desperate. Charisse, Jesus, I didn't know. Who did he talk to, Mick? She asked, her voice turning ice cold. She felt no pity for him. A guy named Yuri, Mick stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. One of the Petrov lieutenants. Greg drinks with a dock worker who unloads freight at Pier 4. The guy was complaining about a massive, off-the-books shipment coming in. Lots of security. Greg didn't know it was you, Castle. I swear to God. He just knew it was a big score moving through the port, and he sold the rumor to Yuri to clear his debt. That's it. That's all he knew. Ramona stared at him for 3 agonizing seconds. He absorbed the information, his face an unreadable mask. Then he reached out and tapped Charisse's shoulder. "We're done," Ramona said. They turned and walked out in silence, leaving the terrified, stale air of the basement behind them. The doors of the SUV thumped shut, sealing them back in the quiet, leather-scented cocoon. The driver put the car in gear, pulling away from the curb before Ramona even gave the order. Charisse stared out the window at the passing grime of the city. The heater blew warm air over her face, thawing the chill from the laundromat, but internally she felt entirely numb. $12,000. That was the going rate. That was what it cost to inadvertently orchestrate a bloodbath, to ruin her life, to force her to hide in a glass tower with a crime lord. Greg hadn't maliciously tried to assassinate a cartel boss. He had just been greedy, careless, and stupid. It was almost worse than if it had been a calculated plot. Her life had been derailed by a man who couldn't balance a checkbook, selling bar gossip to a Russian mobster just to keep his kneecaps intact. "Are you going to kill him?" she asked softly, not turning her head from the window. Ramona was typing a rapid message on a heavily encrypted phone. "Greg? No. He's a symptom, not the disease. The Petrovs are the disease. Greg will end up in a ditch eventually by his own design. I don't need to waste a bullet on him." "He sold you out for 12 grand. He sold a rumor," Ramona corrected, hitting send and sliding the phone into his interior pocket. "He didn't know my name was attached. The Petrovs put the pieces together. It's business." Charisse finally turned to look at him. "Business? Men died last night. I was almost shot. My car is full of holes, and I am sitting here wearing your clothes, and you call it business? What else would you like me to call it?" Ramona met her gaze, his expression completely unyielding. "A tragedy, an outrage. In my line of work, indignation is a luxury that gets people killed. You assess the damage, you identify the leak, and you plug it. That is how you survive." "I just wanted to pay my rent," she whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of her. The adrenaline crash hit hard, leaving a hollow, echoing ache in her chest. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, closing her eyes. "I just wanted to tell him he ruined my life when he left, and instead he ruined it all over again without even trying." Ramona didn't respond immediately. The SUV wove smoothly through the afternoon traffic, ascending out of the crumbling infrastructure of the South Side and back toward the gleaming monoliths of the financial district. "You handled yourself well in there," he said quietly. It wasn't a compliment. It was a factual observation, delivered with his usual clinical detachment. But coming from him, it felt heavier than praise. "I'm used to dealing with the scum of the earth," Charisse said bitterly, keeping her eyes closed. "Clearly." They returned to the penthouse as the sun began to dip below the skyline, casting long, bleeding shadows across the white marble floors. The safe house was quiet. Bennett had left to coordinate the impending retaliation, leaving them entirely alone in the sky. Charisse walked into the sleek kitchen and opened the stainless steel refrigerator. It was stocked with rows of bottled water and imported dark glass beer. She grabbed a bottle, twisted the cap off with her good hand, and took a long drink. It was incredibly cold and intensely bitter. It grounded her, bringing her back to her physical body. She turned around to find Ramona leaning against the kitchen island, watching her. He had shed his heavy coat and rolled up the sleeves of his dark cashmere sweater, revealing faint, jagged scars running along his forearms. He looked exhausted. It was a bone-weary, soul-deep fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. "Do you want one?" she asked, holding up the bottle. "No, I need a clear head." He rubbed the back of his neck, staring down at the polished marble counter. "The Petrovs know their hit failed last night, which means they know retaliation is coming. They will bunker down. The city is going to be very loud tonight." "And where does that leave me?" "Right here." Ramona pushed off the island and walked slowly toward the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked out over the sprawling grid of the city, a kingdom of concrete, glass, and artificial light. "You stay in the penthouse until I tell you it's safe to leave." Charisse walked over to him, standing a few feet away, looking out at the exact same view. The cars below were just tiny, crawling red and white lights. "You know, when I first saw this place, I thought you were just another rich monster," she said, her voice quiet against the hum of the air conditioning. "A guy who pushes buttons and ruins lives from the sky. And now I think you're just trapped in a different kind of basement," she said, taking another sip of the beer. Ramona chuckled. It was a dark, dry sound that barely moved his chest. "That is incredibly profound for someone currently wearing my sweatpants. I'm serious." She turned to look at his profile. "You have all this money, all this power, you own politicians, and yet you sleep with a gun on your dining table. You can't even go home. You're just as stuck as I am." He turned his head to look at her. The cynical armor in his eyes had retreated just a fraction, leaving something raw and incredibly dangerous in its place. "I chose this life, Charisse," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I wasn't pushed into it by a bad break, a missed rent payment, or a stupid ex-boyfriend. I built this. I knew exactly what it cost when I bought the ticket." "And was it worth it?" Ramona looked back out at the city. The reflection of the glass caught the hard, unforgiving lines of his face. "Ask me tomorrow, when the Petrovs are gone." He turned and walked away, retreating down the long, cold marble hallway. Charisse stood by the window, the bottle in her hand, watching the city lights flicker to life. She was a waitress with an overdrawn bank account, currently residing in a mob boss's penthouse, drinking his beer while a gang war raged in the streets below because she had slipped on a cracked phone screen. She took another drink. Tomorrow was going to be a very long day. Midnight arrived with the heavy, muted thud of a helicopter passing somewhere far overhead. Inside the penthouse, the silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp, metallic snick of a rifle magazine locking into place. Ramona stood in the center of the living room. The cashmere sweater was gone, replaced by a black tactical turtleneck and a lightweight, custom-fitted Kevlar vest. He was methodically checking the action on an assault rifle, his face completely devoid of expression. Bennett stood near the private elevator, wearing a similar vest over his tailored shirt, speaking in low, clipped tones into a satellite phone. The marble dining table, where they had drank coffee that morning, was now covered in spare ammunition, suppressors, and maps of the industrial district. Charisse sat on the edge of the white leather sofa, her knees pulled to her chest. She watched them work. It was terrifyingly domestic. They moved around each other with the quiet, practiced efficiency of men packing for a routine business trip, rather than preparing to execute a rival syndicate. Ramona picked up a spare magazine, slid it into a pouch on his tactical belt, and finally looked up. He caught her staring. He set the rifle down on the marble table and walked over to her. The heavy boots he wore made no sound on the floor. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at her pale face and the stark white bandage wrapped around her hand. "Bennett has overridden the security protocols for the building," Ramona said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual cynical edge. No one comes up that elevator without my biometric print. The stairs are locked down with reinforced steel doors at the 40th floor. You are perfectly safe here. I know, Cherise said. Her voice felt small, swallowed by the sheer scale of the room and the gravity of what was about to happen. There's enough food in the kitchen to last a week. The cash is still on the table. If I do not return by noon tomorrow, Bennett's secondary team has orders to come extract you, provide you with a new identity, and relocate you to any city you choose. Charisse looked from his eyes to the Kevlar vest. You're planning on not coming back. I'm planning for all statistical probabilities, Ramona corrected smoothly. The Petrovs are dug into a fortified compound in the rail yards. They have heavy weapons and a numerical advantage. It will not be a clean extraction. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy black object. He held it out to her. It was a compact 9mm pistol. Charisse shrank back slightly. I don't know how to use that. You point it and you pull the trigger, Ramona said flatly. He took her unbandaged hand, placed the cold metal grip against her palm, and closed her fingers around it. Safety is off. It is loaded. Keep it next to you. If someone comes through those elevator doors, and it isn't me or Bennett, you empty the magazine. The gun was heavy. It felt like a physical manifestation of the world she had accidentally tripped into. She looked up at him, her throat tight. Ramona. It was the first time she had used his name. He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Don't die because of my stupid ex-boyfriend, she whispered. The corner of Ramona's mouth twitched, a ghost of a smile, tired and profoundly cynical. I assure you, Charisse, if I die tonight, it is because I made a tactical error, not because of a bartender. He turned away, walking back to the table. He slung the rifle strap over his shoulder. Bennett nodded, ending his call and stepping into the open elevator. Ramona stepped in beside him. He didn't look back. The steel doors slid shut, sealing seamlessly, leaving Charisse completely alone in the sky. Gunfire was immediate. It demanded action, survival, adrenaline. Waiting in the dead silence of the glass tower was a slow, agonizing corrosion of the nerves. Charisse paced the length of the penthouse, the heavy little pistol clutched in her good hand. She walked from the kitchen to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring down at the grid of the city, searching for a flash of light, a plume of smoke, anything that would indicate what was happening in the dark. By 3 a.m. she turned on the massive flat-screen television, keeping the volume barely above a whisper. The local news cycled through weather patterns and political scandals. At 4:15 a.m., the breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. Massive industrial fire in South Rail Yards, multiple explosions reported. The screen cut to shaky, distant footage of towering orange flames licking the night sky, thick black smoke billowing upward. The newscaster's voice was tense, talking about an underground gas line rupture, warning residents to stay indoors. Charisse sank onto the floor in front of the television, the cold marble seeping through her borrowed sweatpants. A gas line rupture. It was a lie, a neat, digestible fiction fed to a city that didn't want to know the truth. She knew exactly what was burning. She sat there for hours, watching the flames on the screen slowly die down to smouldering ash as the sun began to aggressively bleed over the horizon. The sky turned a bruised purple, then a pale, washed-out grey. The clock on the wall read 7:30 a.m. Her diner shift started in 4.5 hours. The thought invaded her brain, absurd and entirely irrelevant. Brenda would be angry. The landlord would tape the eviction notice to her door. Her life, her miserable, freezing, exhausting life, was waiting for her out there. She looked at the thick stack of $100 bills sitting on the glass coffee table. $10,000. She could take it, walk out the front door, and never look back. She could pay her rent for a year. She could buy a new car. She could fix the cracked screen on her phone. But as she stared at the money, a hollow realization settled into her bones. She didn't want her old life back, the cold apartment, the smell of stale coffee, the hollow, gnawing loneliness that had driven her to text a ghost in the middle of the night. It all felt like a faded photograph of someone else. In the span of 30 hours, Ramona Cassell had dragged her into a nightmare, but he had also shielded her with his own body. He had treated her not as a victim, but as a variable. He had seen her. She set the heavy pistol on the coffee table, next to the money. She wrapped her arms around her knees, leaned her head back against the sofa, and waited. The soft electronic chime of the biometric lock echoed through the penthouse at 8:42 a.m. Charisse shot up from the floor, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She stared at the brushed steel doors of the private elevator. A green light flashed above the scanner. The doors slid open. Ramona stepped out. He was entirely alone. He didn't look like an untouchable crime lord. He looked like a man who had survived a car crash. The Kevlar vest was gone. His black turtleneck was torn at the shoulder, the fabric stiff with dried blood. His face was covered in a thick layer of soot, concrete dust, and exhaustion. He held a hand pressed hard against his ribs on his left side, his breathing shallow and uneven. He walked 2 steps into the room, saw Charisse standing by the coffee table, and stopped. "Bennett," she asked, her voice trembling. "Taking care of the cleanup," Ramona rasped. He coughed, wincing heavily, leaning against the kitchen island for support. "The police will find a tragic accident involving unregulated chemical storage. The Petrovs are no longer a concern." He pushed off the counter and limped heavily towards the living area, bypassing the pristine white chairs and collapsing onto the sofa with a heavy, pained groan. He leaned his head back against the leather, closing his eyes. Charisse stood frozen for a second, then her instincts kicked in. She ran to the kitchen, grabbed a clean towel, ran it under cold water, and rushed back to the living room. She bypassed the first aid kit, went straight to the liquor cabinet Ramona kept near the window, grabbed a bottle of expensive bourbon, and brought it all to the table. She knelt beside the sofa. "Look at me." Ramona opened one eye. The opaque, calculating wall was gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered fatigue. "You're still here." "Of course I'm still here. The doors were locked," she said, her hands shaking slightly as she uncapped the bourbon. "Where are you hit?" "I'm not hit," he murmured, his eyes slipping closed again. "Took a shrapnel burst to the shoulder. Broke a couple of ribs diving out of a second-story window when the primary charges went off. I'm fine." "You look like hell." "I've looked worse." Charisse poured a generous measure of the bourbon into a glass and pressed it into his hand. "Drink it." He took it, downing the dark amber liquid in a single, smooth swallow. He hissed as it hit the back of his throat, the alcohol burning away some of the shock. Charisse took the cold, damp towel and gently wiped the soot and dried blood from his face. He didn't pull away. He remained perfectly still, letting her clean the grime from his jawline and his cheekbones. "It's over," Ramona said quietly, staring at the ceiling. "Yuri is dead. The crew is scattered. They won't come back to this city." He slowly turned his head to look at her. The cynical edge returned, duller but still present. He looked past her, fixing his gaze on the thick stack of bills resting next to the handgun on the table. "Your debt is paid, Charisse," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You are not a liability anymore. No one knows who you are. You can take the money. You can walk out of that elevator, and you will never see me again. I will make sure of it." Charisse stopped wiping his face. She looked at the blood on the towel, then at the bruised, battered man lying on the expensive leather. "I have a shift in 3 hours," she said quietly. "Then you should go. I think Brenda is going to have to fire me." Ramona frowned slightly, a wince crossing his face as his ribs shifted. "Don't be stupid. $10,000 is a lot of money, but it won't last forever. You need to return to reality. Reality is overrated," Cherise replied. She tossed the dirty towel onto the glass table, right next to the money. She didn't look at the cash. She looked directly into Ramona's dark, exhausted eyes. "My reality was freezing in the dark, crying over a man who sold me out for pocket change. My reality was entirely invisible." She leaned closer, the scent of smoke, cordite, and copper filling her senses. It was a harsh, ugly smell, but it was incredibly real. "You said I was a nobody," she continued, her voice steady, stripped of the fear that had dictated her life for the past 2 days. "You were right, but I accidentally texted a ghost, and the ghost answered." Ramona stared at her, searching her face for the desperation he had seen yesterday. He didn't find it. He found something harder, something resilient that had been forged in the fire of the last 30 hours. "This is not a game, Cherise," he warned, his voice dangerously low. "If you stay in this room, you don't get to leave when it gets ugly. You don't get to go back to being a civilian. You will be a part of this, and this world will consume you." "I know." "Why?" he asked, genuine confusion breaking through his carefully constructed armor. "Why would you choose this?" Cherise reached out, her bandaged hand gently touching the uninjured side of his chest, feeling the steady, heavy beat of his heart beneath the ruined tactical gear. "Because for the first time in my life," she said softly, a cynical, genuine smile touching her lips, "I finally got the right number." Ramona looked at her for a long, silent moment. The exhaustion in his eyes slowly gave way to something else, an acknowledgement, a quiet surrender to the absolute absurdity of fate. He raised his hand, wrapping his rough fingers over hers, anchoring her there. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city woke up, entirely unaware of the war that had been fought in the dark, or the new one that was just beginning in the sky. What did you think of Cherise and Ramona's accidental collision of worlds? A single wrong number changed everything. If you enjoyed this grounded, gritty Mafia Ramonase, make sure to hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a dark, cynical love story. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a new audio drama. Leave a comment below. Would you have walked away with the $10,000 or stayed in the glass tower? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.